In Too Deep by Alan Cornelsen. Narrated by Alan Cornelsen. Chapter 1. Standing in the Dark. I was standing in the dark when a quote by Albert Einstein suddenly passed through my mind like a bullet from a gun. He said, "Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results." I had spent the last 3 nights talking to myself in the dark, hoping for some kind of validation of paranormal activity. It was like a bad remake of the movie Groundhog's Day, with the same thing happening over and over again. Nothing. Tonight would be my last attempt to find something, I told myself. Time was running out to investigate this fascinating old structure called the Stagecoach Inn, for I only had permission to investigate for 3 nights. This was made very clear to me by the local members of the Ida Grove Historical Society. Time was ticking away, as it was already past the midnight hour, and by now I had pretty much resigned myself to the harsh reality that this investigation would soon be considered a wash. It was mid-October, and the temperature was hovering around 35 degrees. Outside there wasn't even so much as a breeze to drown out the deafening silence from inside the old inn. So, with the cold temperatures and a lack of activity, I was near to calling it a night. I allotted myself 20 more minutes to hopefully experience something. I repositioned my tripod and night vision camera in the doorway that led into the judge's quarters. I then placed a digital recorder on a chair next to the doorway leading to what is referred to the men's room. After placing my equipment, I then walked 5 or 6 steps to the middle of the community room, where I began sweeping my meter from right to left in front of me. After finding no significant readings, I placed the meter on a nearby display case that housed an old American Civil War flag. I stood there for a moment and looked briefly in the direction of the camera and stated, "The house is essentially flat." Flat. That one word was about to change my life for the next 7 years. Only seconds after relating to the camera that the house was flat, something tugged hard and deliberately in the bottom seam of my coat. I quickly turned around, beaming my flashlight in all directions. I was hoping to see if I had inadvertently brushed into something in the darkness of the room, only to find I was several feet away from any object that may have snagged my coat in a manner that it felt it was tugged on. I began rationalizing the event in my head, for there was surely an explanation, but none was to be found. I wish I could explain the impact of that encounter in words, as I suddenly felt very small and alone. My only salvation to that fear of the moment was the camera, sitting on a tripod. That might sound like an odd statement, but the camera had become a companion investigating with me. I can honestly say I felt undiluted fear. I found myself nearly paralyzed, not knowing what would happen next. It was then I suddenly remembered a personal rule I had established to work past the shock and awe and be an investigator. So, gathering myself, I asked the question, "Is there someone in this room with me?" Silence. I stood in the community room for several more minutes, waiting for the proverbial other shoe to drop, but nothing. I remember vividly considering nailing my shoes to the floor to keep me from running out the door, but instead, I calmly walked out of the room and into the men's room just adjacent to the community room. In what would be the southwest corner of the men's room was a wooden chair. It would be from that chair that I would begin to go over the recent events in my head in hopes of creating an explanation. I felt safe in that chair as it was backed up into the corner of the room, leaving me with an unobstructed view of most of the area I was sitting in. I sat there for about 4 minutes when I began hearing movement in the kitchen area. The kitchen was also adjacent to both the community room as well as the men's room. The sound of motion at first was subtle, but evident. Soon the movement stopped, only to be followed by the sound of plates and cups clinking together. It was as if someone or something was preparing a meal. The inn was pitch black, with only a small amount of light from a yard lamp to aid me in seeing silhouettes of objects in the room I was sitting in. I did my best to squint my eyes through the dark doorway leading into the kitchen, as in my panic to leave the community room, I left my flashlight behind. Nervously, I sat in the chair, hoping, or not hoping, to witness something. Again, I remembered my rule, but like any rule, sometimes they're broken. So I sat there as calmly as I could, visualizing myself as a duck on the water, gracefully floating along the glassy bed, only knowing I was paddling like hell under the surface. The sound from the kitchen seemed to move from one side of the room to the other, and at one point, I felt whatever was there was now moving in my direction. I could endure no more. In all my years of investigating, I had never experienced this kind of activity. In fact, in most cases, were dull, and for the most part uneventful, except for a handful of times, but nothing like this. My thought of investigating the inn any further had long since sailed, and my only thought was to get the hell out of there. As I rose from my chair, my feet felt like lead, for fear had nearly constricted my ability to walk, let alone run. I remember that as I passed through the kitchen, my only thought was to look at the floor and only focus on finding my way to the front door. The walk through the kitchen seemed endless, and I could feel my heart beating in my throat. The feeling of hundreds of eyes were piercing into my soul, making me feel vulnerable and helpless. I truly believed it acknowledged my fear, and at any time would capitalize upon that and turn this investigation into a complete nightmare. As I passed the threshold from the kitchen into the drover's room, I heard one louder clink of china. Suddenly the inn's exit seemed to grow further away, but I could make no haste in getting there. As I placed my hand on the door, my fear withdrew, and a sense of calm once again returned. My Durango was parked just outside the door, and I must say it was a welcome sight to see. The hatch was open, so I plunked down on the bumper and fell back into the open cargo space. After lying there for a moment, I sat up and realized all my equipment was still inside. I contemplated just leaving the equipment inside and retrieving it the following morning. But as most may relate, not all of us have deep pockets to get the equipment we need to investigate. We take pride in taking care of those instruments, always putting them away in a neat and orderly manner and never leaving anything behind. So as I sat there, working up the courage to re-enter the inn, I cocked my head back and looked up at the window in front of the inn. I knew it was just in my head. The inn presented a foreboding look. It seemed to grow and loom over me in a threatening manner. Now, after gathering myself for the third time, I mustered up the courage to retrieve my equipment. I remember giving myself a countdown, quietly counting backwards from 3, 2, 1. I bolted up from the bumper of the Durango and moved quickly through the front door of the inn and made my way to the front light positioned in the center of the drover's room. I must have been a bit out of sync, as I was startled for a brief second when something slunked across my face. Out of reflex, I brushed my hand past my face, as well as screamed a couple of expletives. It was then I realized it was the string that I was looking for, and not a true life ectoplasmic encounter. As I stated earlier about the care and how I treat my equipment, I felt no regard for its importance. I grabbed it by the armfuls and tossed it back into the Durango. It took 4 trips inside the inn to retrieve everything. By the last trip, I was clutching the VCR into my armpit. The coax cable wound in my hand, resembling a bird's nest, as the camera dangled from one end, and the coax batting me on the knee. So with the last of my equipment placed in a tangled mess in the Durango, I was then met with the arduous task of entering the inn one more time to turn every light off. Again, I found myself hastily moving through the inn, and with every click of a light my anxiety rose. Now that all the lights were switched off upstairs, I moved down the center staircase only to see something I had no explanation for. The string at the bottom of the staircase was slightly swinging, as if a breeze had moved it. I paused for only a moment, then quickly grabbed the string, disregarding the event to the best of my ability. I just wanted out. I already had more than enough to wrap my head around, and I couldn't let any more events like that string perplex me any further. At last I found my way to the drover's room, where the last remaining light was on. There was only about 3 steps from the string to the door, but it could have well just been 10. I knew as soon as the light clicked off, the darkness would fill the room with only a narrow path of light spilling through the doorway onto the floor from the yard lamp. So after taking a breath, I held one end of the string with my forefinger and thumb, allowing my arm to extend as I walked towards the door. Now with both the string and my arm extended to its limit, I gave it a quick pull. Click! The light was off, and I was only half a step or so from the door. I wasted no time in exiting the inn, pulling the door closed, then swinging the door hasp shut, and lastly securing the padlock. My Durango's glass packs filled the silence of the parking lot as I backed out of the gravel driveway. The power steering moaned a bit because I cranked the wheel so hard to get turned around. Finally, I was out of there, and in my mind not a moment too soon. Driving home, I had concluded that there was truly something with me inside the old inn, and I had the unsettling feeling it still was.